voice for the first time recorded.
Yes, yes. Well, good evening and welcome to Hepburn Shire's Facebook Live presentation, and tonight we'll hear from a passionate speaker. My name's Bradley Thomas. I'm the Director of Community and Corporate Services here at Hepburn Shire, and a pleasure to be your MC for tonight. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I also extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be with us tonight. Our Shire recognises and values the deep and ongoing relationship between the Dja Dja Wurrung people and their traditional land, and acknowledges their living culture and unique role in the life of this region. Unfortunately, here in Hepburn Shire, in the last financial year, there was 185 family incidents reported to police. 185 too many. And of those directly affected, 74% were female and 26% male, with the largest cohort between the 35 and 44 age group, followed by our seniors aged over 55. Hepburn Shire Council takes a leadership position, and this year adopted a leadership statement where Council stated its zero tolerance to violence against women and children, condemning this behaviour as inexcusable, preventable and simply unacceptable. Tonight we want to continue to educate our community on family violence, and have invited Angry Anderson to present to our community. Before I introduce and hand over to Angry, I want to let you know that if any of the topics of tonight or tonight's discussion cause you to become upset, I strongly encourage you to reach out to many of the support networks, our fantastic support services, including Women's Health Grampians. From starting in the mean streets of Coburg, Angry Anderson's journey is one of overcoming family violence, depression and loss. He came to fame as a singer of a hard rock legend's Rose Tattoo, touring the world and influencing many budding musicians, including those in the Guns N' Roses. Social issues have been in Angry's blood, and in 1993 his work as a youth advocate saw him made a member of the Order of Australia. Rose Tattoo were recognised for their contribution to music with their induction into the ARIA Hall of Fame in 2006, and also to the Parks Elvis Hall of Fame in 2015. Outside of the music industry, Angry has been a film and stage actor, TV presenter and politician, and he's also found the time to father 4 children. Angry's been a strong advocate for male health, encouraging men to deal with their emotions, to get regular medical checkups, and promote the importance of having people you can open up to. His list of charity work is long and extensive, and his Facebook bio sums it all up. It's about life, about music, politics, charity work, speaking engagements, acting, family, and many laughs along the way. I'm sure you'll be entertained by Angry tonight, remembering the important message. So please welcome to Hepburn Shire's Council White Ribbon event, Angry Anderson. Over to you, Angry.
Thank you. This is reflection in the screen. Actually, I remember when I first started wearing glasses, my kids told me that it made me look that much more intelligent, but a deception at best. I thank you so much for the invite, and I'm very pleased and I'm honoured to actually be here. This is a completely new medium, if you like, for myself, let alone I think for yourselves. But as I understand, you conduct meetings in this way. Might I just ask a favour that if someone can interrupt at around about, like when it's about 10 minutes from home, because I tend to lose track of time very easily. I suppose when I say fortunately or unfortunately, I have I've experienced, we're talking about domestic violence, obviously. I have experienced domestic violence on different levels, different fronts, if you like, at different stages of my life. But then again, in keeping with the great philosophy of life, which I truly believe in, and I've given myself over to is that nothing in life is wasted. Now, I learned that from a spiritual master many, many years ago. I started studying with a group I had a thirst within me, or a hunger, if you like, to find my spiritual being, because I knew from a very early age that I was a physical entity. Obviously, we inhabit a physical body. But of course, I learned from a very, very early age that there's a great strength that is drawn from belief in something above and beyond who and what we are, which is the biological, materialistic, or the material body, to all outward appearances. But we're driven by, or we're possessed by, in of course, when I say possessed in the very positive manner, by a spiritual force. And that is the force that some people, whether they be religious or just spiritual, we realize that there's more to life, is what I'm trying to say. There's more to life than just our physical existence. Now, in keeping with that philosophy, I have learned the hard road of experience has taught me some very, very valuable lessons. And I am fond of saying, and I have done from a very, very early ages on stage, particularly with Rose Tattoo, which was formed in 1975 and has been in existence in a playing form since then. I mean, with periods of inactivity, but always kept alive as my vehicle for what I believe in and the things that I stand for. Having said that, the reason I mention that is because I think a lot of people that are aware of Rose Tattoo as a band in the early days, and of course it's very easy to be deceived by what we're seeing, not exactly in a lot of cases what is there to see. And I think the best way to explain that is never judge a book by its cover. So Rose Tattoo in the early days was a fascination, if you like, and I mean that fascination in the true sense of the word. People were fascinated by the way we looked and the way we behaved on and off the stage, and particularly on the stage, gratefully. But there was more to us than met the eye. And it's, I suppose, in a way of getting around to, there's more to everything than meets the eye. And anyway, the best place to start a story, I once very, very wisely read, is at the beginning. How does someone end up with the nickname Angry? Angry Anderson. Of course, Anderson is my real surname, the son of Anderson, so to speak. And but Angry, well, we really have to go right back to the beginning to discover. And this will unfold, if I can articulate it well enough in my own particular way. The story starts really with my biological father, Colin, and my mum, of course, Rose May, or Rose Marie, or Rose of the May. Mum's Mauritian, and my father met her when he was my biological father was a jockey, and he was riding meetings in and around Africa in the mid 40s, and he was invited to holiday on Mauritius by my mother's father, and he met my mum. And when I say Rose May, she was her name in French is Rose de May, which is Rose of May, because she was born in May. So he meets her, and she's a 17-year-old, classic-looking Mauritian. So in a dark island-ish way in physical appearance, quite a stunning woman to look at. Of course, very young at 17. And, a romance eventuated. And, of course, my grandfather wouldn't give permission until she was at least 18. So Colin stayed on the island for some time until, 6 months or more, until she turned 18, and then asked for her hand in marriage. And so they lived on the island for a little bit longer, to, I suppose, so that she could sever ties with her family, etc. And unfortunately, and this was something I found out only in my 40s, I was undergoing therapy at the time for to try and save my marriage. But having said that, I was, during the process of the therapy, I was compelled to ask my mother to revisit the very, very beginnings of a relationship with Colin, and for my own reasons, to deal with my own anger issues, etc. Sadness, stroke, anger. And so we went back, and she told me the rather sad and tragic tale of right up until they were married. It was a fairy tale romance. This was this bloke from a place called Australia. He was a very successful and quite famous international jockey. At the time, she thought he was very, very wealthy. Not that that was really important to her, but it was to my grandfather. Long story short, they were married on the island, and Mum arrived in Melbourne with Colin to meet his family in 1947, the year I was born. So she was several months away from giving birth to me. And this is where it really begins, I say, in a real sense, for me personally, was that the story she told was that she arrived, and of course by steamer or ship, she arrives in Melbourne with Colin, who had not prepared her in any great sense for the life that she was about to enter. And it would seem, in a real sense, he had not really prepared his parents and his siblings. He told them very little, as it turned out. I found out later, in later years, talking to my uncles and aunts about my early life. They disclosed to me, which they kept in the early days. They were very distant from me, but that's part of the story. My grandfather, one of my aunties told me the story that they all went down to meet the ship. Mum and Colin came down, and she was obviously pregnant with me, but I think no one was more shocked than my grandfather. Being Mauritian, my mother's quite dark. She's got a very delicate but a very, very pronounced island appearance about her. Jack, my grandfather, was so taken aback that he was a brutal man in every sense of the word, which is another dynamic that we must appreciate. He rejected her on sight. One of the things that I learned about in therapy was there are all different levels of what we call violence. And a lot of them are passive. And we've begun to deal with that as a society in recent days, where there is domestic abuse about the controlling of the person, whether it be the female controlling the male or the male controlling the female. We've seen that particularly women can be intimidated by a physicality, but also they have no power within the household. The money's withheld, money's controlled. their movements are controlled, the way that they dress and the people that they associate with, etc., etc. But anyway, I digress a little. So my grandfather disapproves of mum from very first sighting, and he rejects her outright. And my auntie told me the tragic story that my nana was, besotted with mum because, she had married Colin, and nana took to mum straight away. The other members of the family were not taken aback so much by mum's appearance, but by Jack's reaction to her. And he, as the story was told, turned his back on his son with his about to be introduced daughter-in-law and walked away. And apparently when Colin went to him and asked and said, well, look, what's wrong? He said, as soon as the baby's born, the words to this effect, as soon as the baby's born, I want you to put her back on a ship and send her back where she came from. That's a very, very important dynamic to appreciate in my story. So we go to live with my grandparents, a disaster. I must tell you this part too, which is when they did get to my grandparents' home, it was revealed, to my grandfather that mum was not only dark of complexion and not having a great grasp of English, but she was Roman Catholic. Jack was a Mason, as were the two elder brothers in the family. That's, can only be appreciated by people that understand the implications of that era, Roman Catholicism and Masonry. So that just added fuel to the fire as far as Jack was concerned. So rejected entirely. So the instructions that were given to the family were that the family were to have as little to do with mum and the impending arrival of moi, so as not to form strong family bonds, because as far as Jack was concerned, mum was going back to where she came from. Anyway, my grandparents gave mum, fitted out a room at the back of the house for us to live in. Mum was forbidden for going out in public. Jack was absolutely ashamed of her and embarrassed by her presence. The fact that his son had married such a woman. So little by little, I suppose, people came to know that Colin had brought his bride, pregnant with his first child, back to live with. But of course, very quickly realised that they weren't going to form any strong relationship with her. So anyway, the dynamic is, for the first 6 years of my life, I lived under these conditions because Colin refused to send mum home, which was just one in a long line of antagonisms that existed between Jack and him. In fact, as I found out historically, Jack was not only a physically brutal man, and he held physical sway over all around him. He was a man to be feared, but of course he was violent in his emotional relationship with his family. They were a family ruled over by a bloody-minded patriarch who ruled, I suppose, with an iron fist. So my nana, of course, by this time was standing up for my mother and myself, and so as it unfolded, we stayed at my grandparents' place until I was 6 years old. Which brings me to another thing that, another another dynamic that I'd like to point out is that through our lives, it goes without saying that there are decisions that we make that we're totally responsible or should take total responsibility for. When I say should, too often people make decisions irresponsibly, and they impact on other people, let alone themselves, and they don't take the responsibility for making that decision. But there are a series of decisions that we make for ourselves, usually as a reaction. You know, we learn that in maths at school. For every force, there's a reaction. But there are decisions made by other people that are totally irresponsible, barbaric, violent, if you like, and some of these people make these decisions purely on the selfish motivations. In my story, at around about 5 or 6 years old, I was the victim of pedophilia. And that was a dynamic of violence perpetrated against me, committed against me, that basically changed my life forever. And as you can imagine, so this is where, you know, I try to always represent, not just in talking to people about that, but with the way that I live, the way that I've lived my life. But in those first few years, of course, I was introduced, because I was a child kept at home, not allowed to associate socially, until, of course, I became school age, and then I was at 5 and I was allowed to go to school. But I was introduced at a very early age and to the very value in my life, medium in my life, if you like, that has been my saviour in a real sense, and that's music. The youngest of the Anderson brothers was at that time, until we lost him to dementia, he was a drummer. He was a keyboard player. He played cornet. He sang beautifully, but he was a musician of great skills. Had an amazing record collection, and very quickly that I was introduced to that at a very, very young age, because I spent most of my time inside the house. I mean, I was allowed to go and play in the backyard, of course, but I spent a lot of time with Ivan, and I spent a lot of time under his influence at a very early age. In fact, my mother's she said my first recollection was that you were about 3, and Ivan allowed you to listen to his radio, and a bit later he would allow me access to his record collection, which I'd sit for hours apparently while he played all these wonderful jazz records, and later on, of course, the blues influence that came into my life. Anyway, at that stage, 6 years old, we moved away from my grandparents' home, and we moved into an area in Melbourne. I grew up in Melbourne, called Pascoe Vale, which was a new suburb. It was reclaimed farmland on the outskirts of Coburg, and just the south of. There I was just about to say, like, so is there anybody from Melbourne that's watching? I mean, of course, I know that you're from Victoria, but, you know, having said that, so I grew up in Pascoe Vale, and it was very, very difficult because, you know, the people that bought in our area were buying vacant lots, you know, with pegs in the ground and pieces of string and little flags. And we built a house there, and I grew up in Pascoe Vale into my late teen years. Of course, Colin, and this is the dynamic that I have to introduce, inherited from his father quite naturally. When I say quite naturally, our biological children inherit, you know, much from us as parents. I mean, shape of our ears, the shape of their nose, the colour of their eyes, maybe the height, in any other peculiarities physically, but also we are the inheritors of much of what our parents are as people. Unfortunately, Colin was his father's, even though he hated his father with a passion, and even though his father disapproved of him with a passion, or with, because violence is a passion, he inherited the bad qualities from Jack. And he was, as I said, he was a little bloke. He was a jockey by trade. And I remember him, a vivid memory I have of my childhood, which illustrates, which is what you try to do with anecdotal stories to illustrate moments in your life that were life-changing and or instructive in one way or another. So an esoteric story. I remember as before getting to teens and around about teen age, Colin wanted to teach me to box. He was a part of his training as a jockey, as it turned out, was that he was an amateur boxer and fought more than 20 fights as a boxer, and was a fierce opponent. And I can remember in the backyard, and Colin, I have this vivid memory. There's two things. One is taste, one is sound. And the taste is my own blood in my mouth, and the sound is his voice standing over me on many an occasion. And I can hear his voice like it was yesterday, and he would say, "Get up. Gary, get up." And if I would lay there for more seconds, he would be more demanding. And he would stand over me and demand with no affection. There was no, in fact, I never knew affection from my biological father, another component. I don't remember. I have no memory of him ever holding me as I do with my sons, and they're in their 30s now, but daily I hold them in my arms and tell them how much I love them. I never had that from Colin. In fact, I can't remember one tender moment as a son. And believe me, I have tried, but I don't remember one loving moment. I cannot remember having ever said to Colin, ever in my whole life, that I loved him, or being told by him that I was loved by him. And I have this vivid memory of him demanding that I get up, and only to be knocked down again. Little did he know, little did I know, of course, at the time, it was a painful experience for me. He was teaching me a very valuable lesson. And the very valuable lesson, of course, is almost self-explanatory, is that when you get knocked down in life, you get up. It's one of the fundamental principles of survival. You don't stay down. And life is always going to be, brothers and sisters, let me tell you this with all the authority that I can bring to this statement. Life is never going to be easy. In fact, as I was going to say before, from the stage when I perform, I do say these very things. I try to plant seeds in people's minds and hearts. And one of the things that I've learned the very, very hard way, which is the best way to learn anything of value. I remember Jack used to say, one of the things he used to say to me as a kid, or he used to say to the family, if it comes easy, it's not worth having. He was a belligerent, embittered man, but there was great wisdom in what he said. Well, I don't think he actually realised it, but there was. just as there was with Colin, demanding that I get back to my feet, only to be knocked down again. But it taught me a very, very valuable lesson, and that is that life is always going to be a series of knockdowns. The secret is to always get up and get on with it and do the best you can next time you get up. Anyway, school was, let me say this, school was a traumatic time for me. I went through state school, primary school, apparently was, like most childhoods should be, almost carefree, if you like. But I had this situation at home, which was the absurdity of it. During the day, I seemed to be just like everybody else. I went to school, I laughed, I played in the playground. I was passably good at school, in primary school, but I was going home to a completely dysfunctional household at home. Mum's and Colin's relationship had deteriorated to the point where, for instance, when my brother was born, there was 10 years between my brother and I. When he came along, I was 9, of course, at the time when Mum got pregnant, and she told me that, I was going to have a baby brother or sister. And even at that young age, when I look back on it now, and I thought to myself, this is a really strange thing, but I centered on the fact that I was going to have competition. Anyway, I dealt with that in therapy many years later as well. But looking back on it, Mum and Dad were never the ideal couple. I remember telling Mum the story that I'd go to houses in the street, and I remember coming home one day, and there was a family across the road, and Mum said I must have been all about, like 8 or 9. And I said to Mum, I saw a very strange thing happen today, Mum. And she said, what is that, love? And I said, I was over at the Foskett's house, and Mrs. Foskett was sitting on his knee. They were on the couch, and he's sitting on his knee, and he was kissing her. And Mum said, well, that's what they do. They're, because they're married and they love each other, which of course made it all the more difficult for me to understand. Well, that didn't happen in my house. It didn't happen in my family. Mum and Dad, the only thing that I ever saw between Mum and Colin was Mum's fear of him. And quite a few times as a child witnessed physicality or Colin visiting physical intimidation, if not direct violence on Mum. He always, if I was around though, and Mum and I talked about this many, many years later, he would step away from being physical with her, only to visit on her that physical violence when there wasn't a witness, but there wasn't me. But walls being as thin as what they are, the small or the child mind was hearing sounds which, as a man, he can't forget. Again, being the lack of responsibility that we all must take as males and females, but as males, and I can only speak from my own personal experience, having been a male most of my life. When I say that, I make light of it. And I remember talking at a girls' school, and I said, having been male all my life, and it was later on. I was talking to this group of young women, and one of them said, she said, oh, Mr. Anderson, she said, embryonically speaking, there's a moment, or, after creation, after we become, we're neither And I thought that was a very, and she was all of 17. And I thought it was such a beautiful story. I mean, that she wanted to tell me this, this fact of life, that there's this wonderful moment in our life when we're neither, but hormones, etc., and we take the path of being a female, or we take the path of being a male. And I used that story ever since, because I just found it such a delight, and I just wanted to share that with you. So school was very, very difficult, because once you get past primary school age, of course, what comes along is secondary school. Of course, I went to an all-boys school. In those days, they were called technical schools. And in our area, because it was a very, very working class area, very poor area, families were quite poor in those days in our area. And it was truly working class. It's actually when working class actually worked. So all around us were tradesmen. The person next door, who father of 13 children, was a taxi driver. One of my best mates at school, his father was a long distance truck driver, and also drove a tow truck. So that was kind of the kind of friends I had, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So during that time, and I think this is the other dynamic that's very important in anyone's story, is that round about that time comes puberty. Now, puberty, even when I said there's lots of different levels of violence in someone's life, this is one of them. Biology being, the wonderment, the creational process, demands that the child now becomes something else. Now, in a real sense, emotionally, let alone spiritually. And of course, we're not really taught in Western world spirituality. We're starting to embrace that now. But biologically, puberty is not a peaceful, or is not a gentle transitional period. In fact, it's quite aggressive, and it's quite demanding, and but it is going to produce something which of course we will all benefit from, which is young adulthood in the end. But it is a painful experience. Now, years later, of course, during the therapeutic period, first 20 years ago, we dealt with my transition, because inwardly I was a very, very sad child, and but outwardly I was like a lot of sad kids. I masked that with being Mr. Popular, if you like, or the town clown, if you like. So puberty demanded that I, something change within me, and my sadness, my inner sadness, manifested itself from that time, from early teens right through into my 30s, in the way that I'd been taught by my biological father, and that was violence. And I remember him saying to me as a kid, he said, "You'll always be a little bloke. You'll have to live in a big bloke's world." And he was very belligerent about this. And of course, he was physically a violent man, not just to his family, but to everyone in general. And that's how he lived his life. That's how he taught me to survive, is to be physically violent. But of course, what we've now begun to understand, and we can appreciate now, is that to be physically violent, you must be emotionally violent. Like I said, going back to what I've learned is passive violence. The fact that my biological father never loved me, never showed me any tenderness, never taught me how to be a gentle man. He taught me how to be a violent man with my emotions and with my fists. And like as a biological father, he taught me to swim, he taught me to shoot, taught me how to ride a bike, but he taught me that the way to make my way in life was to be violent. But somewhere in my teen years, and I discovered this through therapy, I made a conscious decision, and I think it might have even been before my teen years. When I say conscious, I think it was conscious, but it would have been possibly an unconscious decision that I would not be what my father was. And I did that to honor my mother. I did that to honor this amazingly strong, beautiful, beautiful human being that I'm fortunate enough to call my mum, who clung to her religion, even when it did not serve her well, when it demanded that she stay in this terribly destructive, violent marriage. Another level of violence, subtle, but it has to be appreciated as a dynamic to fully understand. If we're to understand, and we are to be part of the solution, not the problem. So anyway, the thing was, I got through school. It was very, very difficult for me. But the thing that served me the best was my love of the arts. It started from music. Like in school, just to illustrate a point, I was good at two things. One was art and the other one was English. And I was fascinated by the written word. I started to read books voraciously at an early age, even in primary, but certainly once I got into tech. My periods where I was sent to the library as disruptive, naughty kids, blokes, boys were in. You had to go out into the schoolyard and clean up, pick up rubbish or whatever. That's after you had 3 or 6 of the best, or you went to the library. And while in the library, I mean, why not read a book? So, I mean, I developed a voracious appetite for written literature. And also I found in literature the heroes that I needed in my life to inspire me as a young male, the heroes that conquered the darkness, if you like, and the things in life, because all these wonderful books were written as esoteric lessons. Wonderful stories of adventure, wonderful stories of fictional characters that righted wrongs and defended the weak and put things to right that were, brought order out of chaos. And so I developed a great love of reading English. And so English, lit and grammar. I still grapple with grammar to this day, but it fascinates me. But I was sports-minded as well. I mean, I was just little, so I wasn't destined to be a great sportsman. But I had like all the boys in my area, I had a great passion for physicality, and I wasn't afraid, really, of bigger blokes, physically or mentally. But anyway, I got out of school, and the great love of my life, which was music and motorcycles, as it turns out, my grandfather presented my mother actually at one stage. This is the great story. He came around with these papers, indenture papers, for an apprentice engineer, a diesel mechanic, sorry, for the Navy. And my mum had the wisdom of said, "Oh, look, leave them with me, Jack." And then she showed them to one of our neighbours, and they said, "Oh, these are indenture papers to. So Gary will be off into the Navy, for 7 years." So of course, Mum didn't sign them. Thank goodness for that. But anyway, one of my uncles got me a job as a fitter and turner, apprentice fitter and turner. And I saved up for my first motorcycle. But my great love was music, and blokes that I'd met at school, we were forming bands and we were struggling to play music. So it's been, as I said, the great passion of my life all through my life. So long story short, a series of years went by, a series of bands went by. I got into a band in Melbourne that brought me recognition from touring around Australia, and I eventually ended up in 1974 arriving in Sydney, and I knew that there was, so it was the summer of 74, 75. I'd met some blokes who were later, we were to form Rose Tattoo. And I went back to Melbourne. I packed all my goods and moved permanently to Sydney in 75, and Rose Tattoo were formed. And that basically was the turning point really in my life, as far as the rest of my life, because here I am still here, still craving to perform. Can't wait to get back to work. But so anyway, Rose Tattoo, it turns out, extraordinary band. In fact, using someone else's words, one of the great rock bands of history. Not that I'm going to argue with that, but having said that, again, Rose Tattoo was set up by 5 misfits, if you like, much like myself. As it turns out, years later, when we were close enough, in a sense, to disclose to one another, we all had a similar background to me. Not all pedophile. Well, I'm a survivor these days. I'm not a victim. But a similar background to our domestic lives. And which is, again, why we came together in a band. Birds of a feather do indeed flock together. And Rose Tattoo became famous for 2 things. One, of our physicality, our appearance, but also our very physically exaggerated or exotic, if you like, performances. And we went overseas and made a real name for ourselves, to the point where, which was very generously alluded to in my introduction, that we actually have influenced some other bad boy bands, but none better than Rose Tattoo, I might say, and no one better than Angry Anderson. Which I suppose in a philosophic sense has served me very, very well over these years. And I'm very, very often, apart from being often asked, how did I end up with the nickname Angry, I'm also very often asked, what was the moment that changed your life? What changed it all for you? So we go back to 1982, and I was keeping company with my children's mother, and it was a very, it was an amicable arrangement. She was a very lovely-looking young woman, and so we had a great relationship. But in all honesty, once I came back from the first touring overseas, I did say to her, my life now is going to be spent predominantly overseas touring, and I'm not going to lie. I need to be single to take advantage, full advantage of this, and I must admit at this stage, and it's part of my story, I spent many, many, many years addicted to alcohol. I was becoming addicted to drugs, and I'd always been addicted to bad behaviour, or dysfunctional behaviour. So being Angry Anderson in Rose Tattoo, the baddest rock band in the world, I was being paid to be dysfunctional. So we were at our best stroke worst in those late 70s, early 80s years. And that's when I came to notoriety right around Australia. In fact, I remember Darren Hinch, in his infinite wisdom, once described me as the single greatest threat to the stability of Australian youth, which many years later, when he was appearing on Midday, when I was working with Ray Martin on Midday, I had cause to remind him of that statement, but that's just a personal story. It was 83, my daughter was born. I didn't want to be a father. I thought that because my father was, he was towards the end of his career, he was diagnosed as being criminally or he was a danger to people. He was had a mental condition and lost his license to ride, and he actually spent some time in jail for being he was insane in a sense. They said that he had a mental condition which I don't exactly know what it was, but anyway, he spent some time in not in jail, but an institution. And so I thought, that possibly I would have inherited that insanity, stroke, dysfunction of his. I already, as I said, I was in those days addicted to drugs and alcohol and bad behaviour. And it was serving me well. This is another dynamic we must embrace, if you like, or at least to understand the series of the events that I refer to as my life. But mysteriously, the mother of our children fell pregnant. I went away touring in America, and as I said, at my best stroke worst, my consumption of drugs and alcohol was, ridiculous. And I was suffering really, really badly physically, and mentally I was a wreck, and spiritually I was a desert. And within me, as the wisdom of the great divine dictates, there was a gnawing feeling in me, a hunger, like I said before, a thirst, that somehow there was more to life than this, more to life than sex and drugs and rock and roll. And the divine, in her infinite wisdom, gave me the opportunity to change. And I remember the first time I met Roxanne, she was 3 weeks old. I'd arrived from a break in touring from America. And to this day, I cannot relive this moment without feeling those feelings I felt then. And I remember the first time I met her, and I asked, my mum and dad were there, and her mum and dad, and there was assorted relatives. And I asked, after about half an hour of pleasantries, welcome home and congratulations, you're a father. I asked, could I go and meet my daughter? And as we walked up the hallway, I remember turning to her mother, Lindy, and I say, don't take this too badly, but I felt instinctively I needed this moment with her for myself. I must have sensed, brothers and sisters, the moment. And I do believe this. I think we are given these insights the great wisdom, as I said, of the divine, the creational process, God, if you like, whatever terminology we use to describe what we don't understand but we believe in. And I remember sitting there, we closed the door, and the instruction before I went into the room was, do not wake the child. Don't wake the baby. No, I had no intention of waking the baby. So I remember sitting there on the bed, and she's in a bassinet beside the bed. I sat there for a long time, to the point where I thought I could hear her breathing. She was asleep, of course. And I remember she moved, and it startled me. And her hand came out from under the rug, and it just sat. And I was struck by how small it was. It was no bigger than my thumb. This tiny, perfect little hand. And I remember I couldn't help myself. I didn't intend to wake her, but I took my little finger and I placed it into the palm of her hand, and her fingers closed around my finger, and her eyes opened. And I realized then in a flash, regardless of what had happened up until that moment, everything was going to be all right. From that moment on, I knew there was sense to it all. There was some sort of divine plan, not pre-planned as in we have no control over our own lives. Of course we do. But the wisdom is what I mean, the wisdom of it. And I was struck. And I knew then in that moment, my life as I'd known it was over. And a new life had just begun. And that was in the days that followed, that was a fairly frightening prospect, because I was going to give up all that I knew for her, for this perfect human being, that in that moment when she opened her eyes, now years later I told the story to a group of people, and one of them was a pediatrician. And he said to me after I told the story, he said, Angry, at 3 weeks old, a child, can't focus. Because what I said was, when I looked into her eyes, I saw her. But I was allowed to see her because when she looked into my eyes, she saw me. And I realized in that moment, she looked at me like no other human being had ever looked at me. No judgment. She just saw me. I was her father. And I made a commitment to her. Again, just as years ago, as I made a commitment to Rosemary, my mother, that I would protect her, that I would do whatever I possibly could. Her and any other one like her, any other woman like her. I made that commitment to Roxanne that day, in that moment. I would be the best father she could ever have. And it meant giving up everything I knew, everything. And it was the easiest decision, easily one of the easiest decisions I've ever had to make. And I made a commitment to her. Until this day, she still tells me that I've lived up to that. And in recent times, we've had cause to share our strengths, to share what we have between us. Not just Roxy and I, but the boys as well. So my life changed then forever. And I became, or started to become, the person that I was meant to be because of her. And so far, so good. I went on to work in television. I would never have got the opportunity to work in television if it hadn't been for her. I got my chance in television with Ray from working with street kids. That's another story for another day. I can only imagine. Allow me, if I can put my glasses on and just say, oh yeah, 7:30, 8:30, that's about an hour. So the point is, I think the point that I've always tried to make, brothers and sisters, is the harder it gets and the harder it is, the more opportunity we have to be who we're meant to be. And I've tried to be, as a male, as good a man as my mother dreamt or laboured to produce. She instilled in me an unwavering faith in humanity. She never gave up. One day I wrote a book about all that I've talked about, and I'll tell you about her and what she went through. And I'll tell you about how strong that's made me and the strength that Roxanne's given me over the years, but the commitment I made to her that she would not have a father, biological, but father like I had, but she would have a father that she only knew love from, and my boys too. There's not a day goes by that I don't tell my children how much I love them. We finish every conversation with, I love you. I love you, dudes. My daughter calls me dudes. There's not a time they walk out the door that I don't hug them and kiss them and tell them, which is why I remember the last thing I said to Liam, because it's the last thing I say to them whenever they leave the room. The last thing I would have said to him was, I love you, mate. He would have said, I love you too, Pops. And that's a commitment. So if I'm asked at 73 years old, how's it going? I go, it's going pretty well. So far, I'm doing pretty good. I've turned out to be the man I thought I was always going to be, or should have been, and should be. And I'm grateful. Every shitty, lousy, whatever, it's all been a lesson, and it's all been well worth learning. And there's always, like I say, and I mean this, I know this, brothers and sisters, I know this. It's like the first time I looked into Roxy's eyes, I knew it's all going to be okay. It all is okay. You just got to live up to the commitment of our life itself. We were put here to be good and decent human beings. And at the end of the day, I don't care about too much else apart from the fact that, you know, I've turned out, I want to be a decent human being, and that's what I want for you too. I want you to be the people that you are meant to be. And we can go into the politics and whatever at another time, but two things I want to say. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And the point is, I mean, apart from the fact that, you know, everyone needs to earn a crust. What you've allowed me, this opportunity to talk to you, it's part of my healing. And when I do this, I feel like I'm worthwhile and that I'm doing something that's valuable in a sense to myself. But, you know, if it's true, what I believe, then it's for all of us. And I want to thank you for that, because passively you've not known this, but I want to thank you because you're part of my healing process. And that's something that you need to know from me, and something that can't be valued. So may your God go with you, brothers and sisters, whoever and whatever you see that as. And hopefully one day we'll get to shake hands.
Thank you, Angry. I can't believe how great you've been. Provided so much insight and so open that you have been. I'm sure people that have been on tonight have been touched by your openness, and thank you very muchly for that. Can I say a big thank you for the people that have tuned in? As I said, this is sort of all the way of Hepburn Shire Council really opening the eyes of the community to family violence. And tonight we've had the pleasure of hearing from Angry and his life. And I'm sure each and every one of you has got something out of some of the important words that he said tonight. So thank you, Angry. And
no workers.
Good, enjoy and good night.